Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to see you here. My name is Debbie Cenziper, and I am a longtime investigative journalist and a proud professor at Medill. I teach investigative journalism and I work directly with students on investigative stories for national media outlets. I'm currently writing for ProPublica, which is the largest nonprofit investigative newsroom in the country. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to see you here today as well. I thought I might talk to you a little bit about what I wish I knew when I was your age and I wanted to change the world and become a journalist and write about stories that really mattered to me. And I wish I knew a little bit about what I know now back when I was 17, 18, 19 years old. And so I thought I would give you some of my very best tips about how to do important reporting. I actually started as a student journalist, not much older than you. I started in college writing for my student newspaper at the University of Florida, good state school. And I went on to write for the Miami Herald in Florida, the Charlotte Observer in North Carolina, and the Washington Post here in Washington, D.C. And throughout that time, I focused most of my career focused on social justice issues, writing about people who lived in marginalized communities, writing about very vulnerable people. That's always really mattered to me as a human being and as a journalist and as an educator. And I've been lucky enough to do very high impact stories that changed the laws and prompted congressional investigation and convinced governments to provide help to people in disenfranchised communities. And as a college professor at Medill, I now take students along with me on that journey, and we work on stories together in hopes that we can really amplify the voices of people who need to be heard. And so that's really a goal of mine and of the students that I work with. But it's not easy to do journalism. It's not easy to do it as a student, because you often wonder who's going to take my calls and who's going to listen to me and take the time to answer tough questions. And there are things that you can do as a student journalist, as a young journalist, to make that happen, because student journalists, even at the high school level, have made incredible impact and incredible changes in their communities with particularly with the investigative reporting that's been done at the high school level and at the college level. And so I think if I had to give you my 5 or 6 best tips, the first tip I'd give you is to write about what you know, what's happening in your backyard, in your community, at your school, in your state, in your neighborhood. Don't go broad necessarily right off the bat. Write about the challenges that are affecting the people that you know, your classmates, your teachers, your neighbors. I remember when I was a younger reporter working in Miami, I would drive to work every day to get to the Miami Herald through neighborhoods that didn't have a ton of houses in them. I saw a lot of empty land, an empty lot that was filled with trash and beer cans and overgrown bushes. And as I was driving to work, I noticed there were signs on every lot that said that there was, it said, I actually remember the words, Miami-Dade Housing Agency funded project. And I remember thinking as a young journalist, what is the housing agency funding here? Because I just see an empty lot. And that one observation, driving through neighborhoods near where I live to the newsroom where I worked, led to a year-long investigation in Miami on housing developers who promised to build homes for the poor with government money, but they were instead taking that government money, pocketing it, and buying their own houses or their own pieces of art, or spending it as they saw fit for personal gain, and actually not delivering the houses that they promised. And that project And that investigation led to a massive criminal investigation in Miami. And ultimately, it convinced government leaders to actually start building homes for the poor. And I'll never forget going to one of those new houses after I had spent a year writing about corruption. And I went and spent time with the family that finally, was helped into a house with affordable prices. And I remember that lady, her name was Ozzy Porter, and she held her key above her head and started crying when she got to put the key in the lock of her house, of her first house, of her new house. And that came about in large part because of the work we did as journalists. And that meant something to me. And I still think about it. It's why I still do this work more than 30 years later, because words matter and our work matters and they can actually really help people. But that story started because of an observation. Why was this happening in my backyard? It mattered to me, it mattered to my community. And that's why I did that story. So write about what you see and what you know and what you hear. Second, I often have young journalists come up to me and say, I interviewed 10 questions to my principal or to my school board member, and I'm not getting a response. Nobody's going to talk to me. And one of the mistakes that I made as a young journalist is that, and I think that your generation makes it because you're so used to banging out emails and text messages and messaging people through social medias. We just expect people to respond, but people are busy, right? And anytime anyone calls me or emails me and said, "Do you have like 30 minutes to answer 10 questions in writing?" No, I don't. I'm busy, right? And so the best way to get people to respond to you is to ask them for 10 minutes of their time. Who can say no to 10 minutes, right? And I always call, even now, and say, "Hi, I'm Debbie Cenziper. I write for ProPublica. Can you spare 10 minutes of your time to answer a handful of quick questions?" I don't normally send big lists of questions unless I'm asked for it because nobody wants to take the time to respond to that. But if you go in with just a handful of questions and the promise that you only need a few minutes, that's a hard thing for someone to turn down. Now, of course, your 10 minutes can turn into 30 minutes or an hour of questions, right? Because I find that once you get people to start talking, they really don't want to stop. People like to talk, they like to share their stories. And so, but if you go in the door with just 10 minutes, it's a hard thing to say no to. It really is. I have another tip for you too. And by the way, I'll talk for about 20 minutes, but feel free to put some questions in the Q&A you see on the bottom of your screen because I'm happy to answer questions today as well. So you can start doing that whenever you want. But here's another tip I have for you. Go into interviews prepared, right? You don't want to go in flying blind. You need to know who you're interviewing and you need to do your research so that it looks like you cared enough to do that kind of research before you go in. But don't go in with a script, right? Don't go in with your tape recorder or your reporter's notebook with your 10 questions and stick so closely to that script that the conversation doesn't flow in a natural way, right? If you're talking to your mom or your grandfather, your best friend, it's just like a conversation. You're making eye contact, you're laughing, you're nodding, you're listening, I hear you. But if you go in with the script, a conversation can get really awkward really fast, and you don't want that to happen. So if I'm in an interview and the person I'm interviewing says, "Gosh, that day a tornado hit my house. It was the worst day of my life." And I hear them, but then I go right back to question number 5. "So where did you go to high school? What college did you go to?" The conversation's not flowing in an organic way. So when someone says to you, it was a very difficult day, your very next question should be, "Tell me more about it. What made that day so difficult?" And to get details and color so that you can build out a story. But if you stick to a script, you might miss the humanity in those conversations. And you don't want that, right? You want to know about someone and you want to hear the gritty details so that you can build a story appropriately. So go in with questions, go in having done your homework, but be able to pivot a little bit when you have those conversations so that you can get all that good stuff that happens between questions, right? And I think one of the mistakes I made as a young journalist, and I hope I don't make this mistake now, is I'll go into an interview and I'll be so anxious to impress the person that I'm interviewing that I'm not listening to what that person has to say. I want to flex my muscles because I know exactly what you're going to tell me. I've done my work, but I'm not listening. And the best reporters, the most important trait of any journalist is curiosity. I truly want to know what the person I'm interviewing has to say. Everybody has a story to tell. Everybody, teachers, principals, taxi drivers, our grandparents, everybody has a story. And so I want to hear it. I want to listen. And I want that person to know that I'm listening. How do we do that? We make eye contact. We're not hiding behind a notebook or our questions or our computer typing notes. I'm hearing you. I'm listening. I'm nodding, right? And that person feels heard and understood. And that means that you're building trust with the person you're interviewing, right? And icebreakers help too. I'm sure your journalism professors or newspaper advisors have taught you about an icebreaker. If I go into someone's house and I'm sitting down for an interview and they have a dog or a cat, I have a dog. What's your dog's name? Or did your kids play soccer? My kids played soccer. And I'm looking for that connection at the beginning of an interview so that people not just see me as a journalist, but as a human being, which leads me to my next tip. You are a generation and it's a great thing. You know all about social media and you're connected by your phones and your laptops and your iPads in so many ways. But the best way to talk to someone is in person. And so I always tell my students, get out from behind your computer and go sit down with someone. Sure, a coffee shop is great, but if you can sit down with someone in their office to see what kind of books they have on the bookshelves or in their living room to see what kind of music they might be listening to, that really helps because you can really build a rapport by finding just moments that or examples of things that you might share together. I one time interviewed a medical examiner. I don't know if you know who medical examiners are, but these are the pathologists that do autopsies. They're death investigators. And I was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I was so intimidated to go interview this doctor. All he does is autopsies all day. And I sat down with him in his office, and he was such like a 60s and 70s music fan. He had like Jerry Garcia beads coming down in his office and like these psychedelic lamps going. And it totally put me at ease. And it completely humanized this man who was about to go into a morgue. And I was about to follow him to write a story about death investigations. So it helps to be able to sit down with someone on their turf to really understand what makes them tick and to find things that you might share in common. Because honestly, we have more in common with strangers than we think we do, and that goes for all kinds of sources that we're interviewing. Another tip I have is often as journalists, we're interviewing people sometimes at moments in their lives that are the most tragic, the most sensitive. Something happened to their homes, to their communities, to their families. They're scared. They are in survival mode, right? That's what we do as journalists. We're writing about those extremes in some ways in people's lives. And we have to go in with grace and sensitivity. I say all the time to my students, to my own children, to anyone who will listen, and I do not apologize for this. that I am a human being first and foremost, a journalist after that. I identify as being a journalist. It's part of my identity, but I am a human being. And so we have to be careful when we go to interview people that we're not out just to get that story, but that we do it following all of the common sense ethical standards that we have in this industry. It matters because not everybody believes in journalism anymore. Fake news. I don't talk politics, but fake news and all of that stuff can affect the way people look at us. And if we go in as journalists with strong reputations and an ability to relate to people and an ability to be sensitive, it helps generate trust, not just in me as a journalist, but in our incredibly important profession. And I remember a couple of years ago, it was actually more than a couple of years ago, there was very bad flooding in Texas, in Houston, horrible flooding. And families were taking their belongings in plastic bags and rushing to safety. And there was a television reporter at the time who interviewed a mom who was grasping her child's hand, having just, survived this flooding and had lost everything they had. And this journalist did exactly what she should have done. She said, "Can I talk to you?" And she put a microphone and a camera, in the face of this devastated mother. And the mom was answering questions. And at some point, the mom just lost it. She couldn't do it anymore. She said, "That's enough. I'm done with this interview." And the journalist did exactly what she probably should have done, which she said, "Okay, I understand. Thank you for your time." Because at the end of the day, we want that story, but we want to be careful about the people that we're writing about and understand the sensitivity sometimes of what we're doing. Which leads me to my next tip. There are different kinds of interviews that we do, right? Politicians, they spot you from a mile away. They know exactly what to say to journalists. They know what a soundbite sounds like and what a quote looks like. They know exactly, they've had media training, so they know exactly what it is that they're doing. But when you do an interview with someone who's never been interviewed by a journalist before, you have to remember that they don't want to look embarrassed. They don't want to say anything that could hurt them at work, that could embarrass their families, that could reveal something that they might not want revealed. And so you have to handle those interviews with great care. I will often say to people, look, you're not going to see your name in print until you hear back from me. There's no surprises. I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm not going to show you my story in advance. We don't do that. But I'm going to give you a general sense of what we might say so that you know in advance that you won't see anything in print that you're not particularly comfortable with. I don't do this for everybody, and I don't do it for politicians or people that I'm confronting, the targets of investigations. But for everyday people who have never been interviewed before, I don't want them to be surprised when they see their names in print. And by offering that reassurance, it builds trust early on with people that I'm interviewing. Have you all heard the phrase, I'm sure, off the record? I often have people say to me, "I'll talk to you off the record." And I often say, "Okay, but I want a chance to get you on the record." And the way that I do that, and it works 95% of the time, is not only do I build a rapport with them, but I call them back and I talk to them about what the story might say without sharing details in advance. And then they say, "Okay, that sounds good." And I can often convince them to go on the record. So those are some of my interviewing tips. I'm going to give you two more tips. Um, One is in terms of writing or editing or publishing, we spend so much time as journalists reporting out a story, right? Whether it's a couple of days, a week, sometimes I spend a year or more on a project, and that's a very fortunate thing in today's world, but I've been given the time to do it. You should invest just as much time in the execution of your story that you do in the reporting, right? You want your words to make sense to readers. You want your script to make sense. It doesn't matter how great your reporting is if nobody reads it. right? And so I spend a lot of time on the writing. I read my stories out loud to make sure that the words make sense, that the sentence structure makes sense, that there's rhythm to my sentences, that I use powerful verbs and not many adjectives. Adjectives are not your friend as a writer, but verbs are great because they're action and it's powerful. And I spend time on my words because I don't want people to get to my fifth paragraph, say I've had enough and stop reading. Readers only spend a couple of seconds, if you're lucky, a minute or more with the story, and that is it. Every word counts. And so I spent a lot of time honing my writing skills, not just my reporting skills. And then the last tip I'll give you today is this: all we have as journalists is our reputations, right? If you want people to read what you write and to believe it because you're writing with authority, you have to protect and nurture your reputation first and foremost, because it's very easy for people in this day and age. And I bet you've heard these kinds of criticisms of the media to say, I just don't believe the media. I don't believe anything I read, or the media is biased, or the media, is falls to the far left or the far right, whatever. You have your reputation and you protect it. And the way you do that is to make sure that everything you write is accurate. Accuracy matters. So when I write stories, no matter how much I love my reporting and how much I love the words, I check every single fact. There's a phrase in journalism that some of you might have heard, which is, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And what we mean by that is, don't ever assume that we've got a name spelled correctly, a street name spelled correctly, an age that is accurate. Check and double check everything in your story. Because if you don't get it right, it will hurt your reputation as a journalist. And we always want to be right. You know what keeps me up at night? And I'm going to leave it at this: two words: fact error. I hate the idea of getting something wrong. It terrifies me because all we have as a journalist is our reputations. And when you're accurate, you protect and preserve your reputation. So spend some time fact checking every word of your story. Don't ever think someone else is going to do it for you, a colleague, an editor, even a fact checker at a magazine. Do it yourself, because it's your name on the line and it's your reputation. And that's what we hold dear as journalists, because if our reputations are intact, if our stories are accurate, if our stories are read, if our stories are well reported, we can really, really do important things in this world. As I said at the beginning, we can shine a light on issues and on communities, on people that don't always get a lot of attention. And that is badly needed. It's why I became a professor, because I want to teach students like you how to do this kind of work so that I know that journalism, which is so important to our world, is in safe hands moving forward. So thank you, everybody. I'm happy to answer a handful of questions. And again, I appreciate you being here. Um, let's see. How do you balance trying to catch everything they're saying with being engaged in the conversation? Do you recommend taking notes, recording? Great question. I get asked that all the time. And I'm going to give you the truth, which is totally embarrassing, but I don't care. I am so terrified of recording a conversation because I'm afraid my recorder on my phone won't work. I can barely turn on my televisions at home without my help from my kids. I can't work a remote control. So I don't record for that reason. I take notes. Over time, you learn how to take notes quickly. You learn shorthand. And so when I'm in person, I take a good old fashioned reporter's notebook that you can buy for $1.50, and I just take notes. But I've learned my own shorthand so that when I'm taking notes, I look over my notebook and I can talk to someone and I can make eye contact. When I'm on the phone and I click on my computer and I'm taking notes on my computer, I will often say to report to my sources, especially those that have never talked to a journalist before, you're going to hear me taking notes, but I'm listening to every word you have to say. So don't get nervous. You learn over time what works for you. And my students often record. Now, you should always ask if you can record, right? I don't care what the law is, it's the right thing to do. And so often my students will record. You have to find what works for you. And I promise that you will find that sooner rather than later. What's the best way to get involved in investigative journalism in high school while dealing with censorship? School administrators censor articles published in the newspaper, and I'm struggling to find a way to write about the issues. Gosh, I hate the word censorship, and I'm so sorry that that is happening to you. You know, there's no easy answer to that. I wish there was. I can tell you that after high school, it's a whole new world. First of all, as I said at the beginning, incredible journalism has been done by high school journalists, and they have overcome in different situations issues of administrative censorship. And there's no right answer, and I need more specifics. But I will tell you that after high school and you get to college at a place like Northwestern, there is a very robust independent student newspaper at Northwestern and at other universities, and they're making a difference every single day. So yeah, that's a very, very difficult question to answer. Particularly interested in the rising podcast types of interviews. Oh, I love podcasting, and I think that audio journalism is becoming so popular for all of the right reasons. In fact, there's a Pulitzer Prize category now for audio work done. And so I think that in any forum you choose, you can practice the tips that I taught you: good interviewing, powerful scripts, good, smart questions. It's hard as a journalist. If you do a lot of work, you have to like synthesize your facts into a 3-minute podcast or, a 1,000 word story. And I think that over time as journalists, you learn more and more how to do that. But I love podcasting. I actually partnered and I had my students partner with a, many podcasting, many journalists who specialized in podcasts. It's a great way to tell stories. Let's see, I'll take one or two more. How do you handle the rejection of a person who denies an interview? Great question. I'll tell you, it's never personal. It's never personal. I always take it personally. It's never personal. People are afraid, again, of what they might say and how they might come across in your story, especially people who have never been interviewed by a journalist before. If you go out on the street because there's been, for example, who knows, a natural disaster and your editor sends you out on the street and you've got your notebook, you're going to find someone and you've had no advanced planning. And all of a sudden you say, hey, I'm Debbie, I'm a journalist. Can I ask you a few questions? They're going to get nervous, right? They will. Again, I go back to a couple of tips. One, I often say to people, even now, I know it's unusual to get a call from a journalist. I know that it's a little bit intimidating. If you just let me tell you a little bit about what my story is about, I think you'll feel more comfortable. And then I promise you, you will not see your name in print until you hear back from me. And that one little bit of reassurance might be enough to get someone to talk to you. Now, I'm an investigative reporter, and so I often have targets that I'm going after, right? People who don't ever want to hear from me and who will run in the opposite direction when they hear from me. People who have done bad things, people who steal money, people who hurt people, government politicians who promise but never deliver. They don't want to hear from investigative reporters. And so despite my best efforts, they may never say yes to an interview. But you know what I do? I call them. I email them. I send certified letters. I send text messages. I reach out through LinkedIn. When I was a young reporter, I thought, gosh, if someone doesn't respond, I just get to type in my story, did not respond to a request for comment or declined to comment. I'm all done, right? Easy breezy. But honestly, I've learned over the years that I want to present all sides in a story. I want to show my readers that I took the time to present all sides of a story. I want to give my targets a robust response because it builds my credibility up as a journalist, that I want you, dear readers, to make up your own minds about what I have to say. So sometimes, despite my best efforts, I can't get people to take my calls, but I often use some of the tips that I gave you today to try to get as many people as possible to come to the phone or to answer my questions. I'll take one last one. Let's see, what would you advise students that are currently at school to do to approach journalism? I'm not sure if that's about stories or about how to become a journalist, but I will tell you this. Um, the best way to do journalism, the best way to become a journalist is to do journalism, right? You want to be working on as many stories as you can in any format, television, radio, anything, print, documentaries, anything. You want to be practicing your skills. It's never too early. You can start in high school, but you should definitely do it in college. At Northwestern, as I said, not only do we have a student newspaper that's doing great work, but we have a student-run magazine that's doing terrific work. And then our professors at Northwestern often partner with students so that students can I do it, so students can work directly with professors, not just on research, but on stories for print. So we have multiple programs at Northwestern where students are getting bylines now in professional media outlets. The more you do, the more you learn. And then you build up this body of work that you can then submit with your resume eventually to get a job in journalism. I'm working with a group of students now. We're currently publishing an investigative series in ProPublica, and students are getting bylines now. In fact, one of my most successful students, I work with grad students as well, but one of my most successful students was an undergraduate who worked directly with me last year on a series of investigative stories and had bylines, top billing, her name, top billing on all three of our major stories. And she was an undergraduate at Medill. So get involved right away once you get to school, working with your student newspaper, other media outlets, or even seizing opportunities offered by your professors. It's practice is the best way to get into this profession. Thank you so, so much, everyone. I really enjoyed meeting you. I wish you all the best on your journey. You've got some exciting years ahead. Enjoy every minute of it. And thanks for joining me today.